The moment Marcus Garrett's hand touched the iron latch of his front door, something made him stop, some unnamed instinct that had kept him alive through cattle drives and droughts, and a war that had taken better men than him. And when he pulled the door open wide into the cold October air of 1878, he found her standing on his porch before she had even raised her fist to knock. She was soaked through to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her cheeks, her boots caked in red Texas mud that told him she had walked a considerable distance in the rain that had been hammering the hill country since sundown. She was clutching a bundle of wool blankets so tightly to her chest that her knuckles had gone white, and from inside that bundle came a sound so small and fragile it barely rose above the sound of the rain, the soft, hiccuping cry of a newborn infant. Marcus stood in the doorway and stared at her, and she stared back at him with eyes the color of Winter Creek water, green and deep and full of a fear she was working very hard to hide behind a lifted chin. "I am looking for Marcus Garrett," she said, and her voice was steadier than any voice had a right to be from a woman who looked like she had been dragged through every mile of the Texas hill country on her hands and knees. "You found him," Marcus said. She swallowed hard. "My name is Nora Hurst. I was a friend of your brother Daniel's. He told me if I ever found myself in serious trouble, I should come to you." Marcus had not heard his brother's name spoken aloud in 14 months. The word landed in the center of his chest like a stone dropped into still water, and he felt the ripple of it move through him slow and cold. "Daniel is dead," Marcus said, because it was the truth, and he had learned a long time ago that the truth was the only thing worth saying, no matter how much it cost you to say it. "I know," she said quietly. "I was there when he died." The rain intensified, sending sheets of water cascading off the edge of the porch roof and splashing against the mud at her feet. The bundle in her arms stirred and the small cry grew louder, more insistent, and Marcus watched the woman named Nora Hurst draw the infant closer to her chest with a tenderness that was entirely unconscious, entirely automatic, entirely genuine. He stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. She crossed the threshold without hesitation, as if she had already weighed every other option available to her and found them all wanting. Marcus closed the door against the storm and turned to look at her properly for the first time in the full light of his oil lamp, and what he saw made something complicated happen behind his sternum that he chose, for the moment, to ignore. She was perhaps 24 or 25 years old. She was not beautiful in the way that made men stupid. She was beautiful in the way that made them careful, the kind of beauty that had been shaped by intelligence and difficulty, and the particular grace that comes from having survived things that would have broken someone smaller. There was a bruise along her left jaw, old enough to have gone yellow at the edges, and her lower lip had a small healed cut that told its own story without requiring words. The baby in her arms was maybe 2 weeks old, perhaps 3. He could not tell much beyond that. The infant's face was scrunched and red with the effort of crying, and it waved one tiny fist in the air with all the fury and impotence of the newly arrived. "Sit down by the fire," Marcus said. "I will get towels." He moved through his house with the particular efficiency of a man who had lived alone for a long time and had organized his domestic life accordingly. He kept the place clean because disorder made him irritable, and he kept it stocked because the nearest town, Caldwell Creek, was 11 miles of rough road away. He retrieved 2 thick towels from the chest in his bedroom, and on the way back through the kitchen, he put the kettle on the stove and added another log to the firebox without thinking about it. When he returned to the main room, Nora Hurst was sitting in the rocking chair beside the hearth. She had unwrapped the outer layer of wet blanket from the baby and was holding the child against her shoulder, patting its back in a slow rhythm. The infant had settled somewhat, its cries reduced to intermittent complaints. Marcus handed her one of the towels and set the other on the arm of the chair. She accepted it with a nod and draped it around her shoulders without letting go of the baby. "When did you last eat?" Marcus asked. She considered the question with what appeared to be genuine uncertainty. "This morning, early. I have cornbread from supper and leftover beef stew still warm on the back of the stove. I do not want to impose." "You are already inside my house in the middle of the night," Marcus said, not unkindly. "The time for worrying about imposition has passed. I will fix you a plate." He went back to the kitchen and ladled stew into a deep bowl and cut a generous wedge of cornbread and carried both back to the fire. She accepted the food with the restrained desperation of someone who is ravenously hungry and too proud to show it, and she managed to eat with one hand while keeping the baby balanced against her with the other in a feat of coordination that Marcus found quietly impressive. He sat in the straight-backed wooden chair across from her and waited. He had spent years learning how to wait. It was one of the skills that distinguished a man who survived the frontier from one who did not. You did not press people when they were cold and frightened and hungry. You fed them and warmed them and let them come around in their own time. She finished most of the stew and all of the cornbread before she set the bowl aside and looked at him directly. "I should explain," she said. "You do not have to do it tonight," Marcus said. "I think I do," she said. "I think you deserve to know what you have let into your house." He waited. She adjusted the baby on her shoulder and looked into the fire for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and level, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed her confession sufficiently that she could deliver it without breaking. "I came to Texas from Kansas 2 years ago. I was engaged to a man named Clarence Rutherford. He presented himself as a man of substance and good character. He owned a dry goods store in Abilene and he was respected in the community, and he came from a family with a good name." She paused. "He was also a drunk and a liar and a man who believed that a woman's face was an appropriate place to express his frustration." Marcus said nothing. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I met your brother Daniel about 8 months after I arrived. He was passing through Abilene on his way south to San Antonio, and he stopped in Clarence's store for supplies. He saw the state of me that day, and he was the first person who had looked at me with anything other than pity or indifference in a very long time." She looked down at the baby. "He sat with me on the back steps of the store for an hour while Clarence was at the saloon, and he told me that I was not required to remain in a situation that was destroying me. He told me that if I ever needed help, real help, I should go to his brother Marcus Garrett, who had a cattle ranch outside a town called Caldwell Creek in the Texas Hill Country. He said you were the most decent man he knew." The fire crackled and popped. Marcus kept his face still, though the words moved through him like something warm and unwelcome. "Daniel died 6 weeks later," Nora continued. "He was robbed on the road outside San Antonio, shot." She said it plainly, without sentiment, and he understood that she had already grieved it in her own way and in her own time. "I did not hear about it until 2 months after. By then Clarence and I had things had gotten worse. I had stopped going to church because I did not want people to see me. And then I found out I was with child, and I thought that maybe Clarence would." She stopped, drew a breath. He did not. He made it very clear that the child was an inconvenience and that I was a greater one, and when the baby came he was not even present. He had gone to Wichita on some errand of his own. "The baby is not his?" Marcus asked carefully. Nora looked up at him. There was something complicated in her eyes, not shame exactly, but the residue of something that had once been shame and had been burned into something harder and more durable. "The baby is mine," she said firmly. "His name is Henry. Henry Daniel, actually." She paused. "His father was a man named Robert Keene who worked at the livery stable. He was kind to me during a time when I badly needed kindness. He died of a fever before Henry was born. He did not know about the baby." She looked back at the fire. "I am not asking for your judgment on any of that. I am only asking you to understand why I left." "I am not judging you," Marcus said. She studied him for a moment as if checking the statement for hidden barbs. "I took Henry and what money I had managed to hide over 2 years of careful saving, which was not much, and I bought passage on the stage to Austin, and then hired a man to bring me as far as the road to Caldwell Creek. He left me at the crossroads. It was already raining. She gestured vaguely at her wet clothes and her mud-caked boots. The rest is self-evident. How far did you walk? I'm not entirely sure. Several miles. The sign at the crossroads said Garrett Ranch, and I followed the track. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the roof, and the fire popped and the lamp swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the baby named Henry made a small sound of drowsy contentment against Nora's shoulder. You can stay, Marcus said. She looked at him sharply. I did not come here asking for charity. I know you did not. I can work. I am not delicate and I am not incompetent. I can cook and sew, and I know something about cattle from my father's place in Missouri. I can earn my keep. I have no doubt of that, Marcus said. I have a spare bedroom. It has a proper bed and a chest of drawers and a window that faces east so the morning light comes in. You are welcome to it for as long as you need it. And tomorrow, when it is daylight and not raining, we will figure out the rest. She looked at him for a long moment with those Winter Creek eyes, and he could see her doing the calculus of it, the risk and the necessity and the sheer exhaustion of having no other viable option. And then something in her shoulders dropped an inch, just 1 inch, the specific physical release of a woman who has been bracing herself for so long she has forgotten what it feels like to stop. Thank you, she said quietly. I will not forget this. It was Daniel's recommendation, Marcus said, and stood to show her the room, though they both knew that was only partially true. The next morning broke clear and cold. The sky washed a brilliant hard blue after the night's storm, and Marcus was up before sunrise as he always was, dressed and in the kitchen with the stove going and coffee on before the first orange light touched the tops of the post oak trees that lined the eastern fence of his property. He heard the baby first, a thin, reedy cry that came through the wall of the spare bedroom, and then the low, soothing murmur of Nora's voice, and then quiet again. By the time she appeared in the kitchen doorway, Henry was settled in the crook of her arm, wrapped in a clean blanket she had found in the chest of drawers, and she had done something to her dark hair that pulled it back from her face and made her look more composed and considerably less like a woman who had spent the previous evening walking through a Texas rainstorm. Good morning, Marcus said. He poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the table. Good morning, she said. She settled herself carefully into a kitchen chair, managing the baby with the particular economy of movement that new mothers develop out of pure necessity. She accepted the coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug and breathed in the steam. How long have you been awake? About 2 hours, she raised an eyebrow. And what have you accomplished in 2 hours? Fed and watered the horses, checked the fence line in the south pasture that the rain likely damaged, started on breakfast. He gestured to the stove where a pan of scrambled eggs was staying warm alongside a plate of thick-sliced bacon. You run this ranch alone, she asked. I have 2 hired hands. Emmett Cruz and a boy named Pete Donahue, who is 19 and enthusiastic if not always accurate. They bunk in the smaller cabin by the barn. He began fixing 2 plates. I had a 3rd hand, but he moved on in August, followed a girl to San Marcos. He said it without judgment, just as a fact of how the world worked. How large is the ranch? 1,200 acres, about 600 head of cattle right now. It is modest by some accounts, but it is mine and it functions. She was quiet while he set the plates on the table and they both ate. The baby dozed. Through the kitchen window the morning light was coming in gold and generous across the wooden floor, and somewhere outside one of the horses was making a complaint about something, and the ranch sounds came in through the thin walls, the distant voice of Emmett Cruz calling something to young Pete, the creak of the barn door. I meant what I said last night, Nora said after a while. About working. I am not a woman who can sit idle. Marcus looked at her across the table. She had the kind of directness in her gaze that he found both unusual and genuinely appealing in a way he was not prepared to examine too closely yet. What did you have in mind? Cooking, to start. I can see you manage well enough on your own, but two of you eating the same thing every morning is a particular kind of dull. I can cook properly. I can also mend and wash. And when Henry is a little older and I am not feeding him quite so constantly, I can do more besides." She paused. "I am also good with accounts if you have any bookkeeping that needs attention." "The accounts," Marcus said slowly, "are something of a disaster." A small, genuine smile moved across her face, the first one he had seen, and it changed her entirely, opened something in her expression that had been closed, let a brief warmth into those careful eyes. "Then we have our arrangement." "We do," he agreed, and the word "we" settled into the room with a quiet significance that neither of them acknowledged directly. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Marcus with its naturalness. He had grown so accustomed to the particular silence of a solitary life, the silence of a man who speaks primarily to horses and hired hands and the occasional traveling merchant, that he had half expected the presence of another person in his house to feel like an intrusion. It did not. Or rather, it felt like an intrusion in the same way that the returning of a thing to its proper place constitutes a disruption to the disorder that had accumulated in its absence. Nora was efficient and unsentimental about domestic work in a way that suggested she had been doing it for herself and others for most of her life. The kitchen, which had been functional but joyless under Marcus's sole management, became within 3 days a place of genuine warmth and impressive output. She made proper biscuits and a beef, an onion pie that made Emmett Cruz stop in the middle of a sentence about fence posts and simply stare. She made a pot of pinto beans with smoked pork that lasted 3 days and improved with each reheating. She attacked the accounts ledger with a pencil and a focused expression, and a series of small decisive sounds that suggested she was finding what she had expected to find. And within a week, she had reorganized 4 months of chaotic record-keeping into something legible and logical. Henry was a peaceful baby, as it turned out. He slept in long, reliable stretches and was content, when awake, to lie on his back on a folded blanket on the floor and examine the ceiling with the profound seriousness of a small person encountering the concept of existence for the first time. Marcus found himself pausing his work more often than was strictly necessary to crouch down beside the baby and offer his finger for the infant to grip, which Henry did with a strength entirely disproportionate to his size. Marcus did not examine these moments too carefully either. Emmett Cruz was a compact, capable man of 32 who had come up from Laredo 7 years ago and had been with Marcus for 4 of those years, and was as much a fixed feature of the ranch as the water tower or the old pecan tree by the gate. He was formal with Nora in the way that decent men of his background were formal with women, hat in hand at the door, yes ma'am and no ma'am, but his dark eyes were warm, and he accepted her presence on the ranch with the equanimity of a man who had seen enough of the world to not be surprised by its arrangements. Pete Donahue, who was 19 and freckled and honest in the way that only the very young can sustain without effort, fell into a kind of helpless admiration for Nora that expressed itself primarily in offering to carry things, and in consuming everything she cooked with extravagant and vocal appreciation. Nora treated him with an affectionate practicality, as if he were a large and well-meaning dog, which Pete seemed to find entirely acceptable. 2 weeks after Nora's arrival, Marcus was in the barn in the late afternoon repairing a bridle when he heard her come in. He knew it was her by then. He had already learned the particular sound of her step, the way she moved with a quiet deliberateness that was different from the heavier boots of the men or the heedless clatter of Pete, and he kept his hands on the leather and the awl and said, without looking up, "Something on your mind?" He heard her settle herself onto a hay bale. Henry made a small conversational sound. "I received a letter today," she said. "From Clarence." Marcus set down the awl slowly. "How did he know where you were?" "I am not certain. He may have tracked me to Austin, and then he has connections. He is the type of man who makes connections and then uses them." Her voice was steady, but he could hear the fine tension underneath it, like a wire pulled slightly too tight. "He says that if I do not return to Abilene by the end of the month, he will come and collect me himself." Marcus was quiet for a moment, turning a small piece of leather over in his hands. "You were not married to him. We were engaged." In the eyes of most people in Abilene, that was sufficient to constitute an obligation on my part. And in the eyes of the law, an engagement is not a legal contract. He has no lawful claim on me. She paused. But a man like Clarence Rutherford does not always concern himself with the lawful aspects of things. Marcus looked at her then. She was sitting upright on the hay bale with Henry in her lap, and she was meeting his gaze with that direct, clear-eyed quality that he had come to understand was how she faced things she was afraid of straight on, without flinching, as if courage were a decision you made fresh in every moment. "This is my ranch," Marcus said. "Caldwell Creek is my county. Sheriff Alderman in town has known me for 12 years. If Clarence Rutherford comes here, he comes here without any authority over anyone on this property. Is that understood?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Marcus," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, "I do not want to bring trouble to your door." "You arrived at my door," he said, "carrying Daniel's namesake through a rainstorm, on the recommendation of my dead brother, who apparently was a better judge of character than I gave him credit for. The trouble, such as it is, has been invited in and given the spare bedroom. We are well past the point of worrying about it now." Something shifted in her expression, something cracked open very slightly, like frost beginning to give way to actual warmth, and she looked down at Henry for a moment. "All right," she said finally, quietly. "All right." The following Sunday, Marcus drove Nora into Caldwell Creek in the wagon, ostensibly to purchase supplies, and also, he acknowledged privately to himself, to introduce her to the town before the town invented its own version of her arrival. Small frontier towns were extraordinarily efficient at the manufacture of narrative, and Marcus had lived in Caldwell Creek long enough to know that a story planted correctly was considerably less dangerous than a rumor left to grow on its own. Caldwell Creek was a proper if modest town, the sort that had risen from a crossroads and a water source, and the determined optimism of several dozen families who had come west and decided that this particular patch of Texas was where they were going to put down their roots and be justified. It had a main street of packed earth flanked by a general store, a feed and grain, a blacksmith's, a small bank, 2 saloons of varying repute, a doctor's office, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse 3 days a week, and a hotel that also served meals and was run by a widow named Francine Beaumont, who knew everything about everyone and dispensed this knowledge with the precision of someone who understood its value. Nora sat beside Marcus on the wagon bench with Henry in a sling arrangement she had fashioned from a length of cotton cloth, and she held herself with a composed dignity that Marcus respected enormously, because he could see beneath it the effort it cost her. She was walking into a town full of strangers while carrying a baby that was not fathered by the man sitting beside her, with a fading bruise on her jaw and a life story that had not, up to this point, been particularly kind to her. She did so with her spine straight and her chin level. He introduced her to Francine Beaumont first, strategically, because Francine was the town's most efficient information network, and whatever Francine understood about Nora would become what the town understood. Marcus told it plainly. Nora was a friend of his late brother Daniel, a woman of good character who had found herself in difficult circumstances and who was now working on the Garrett ranch. He said it without apology or embellishment, as a statement of simple fact, and Francine Beaumont looked at Nora with her sharp and not unkind eyes, and then looked at Henry, and then looked at Marcus, and evidently decided that the situation was acceptable, which meant the town would decide the same. At the general store, Marcus introduced Nora to Hiram and May Stokes, who ran it together with the coordinated efficiency of 2 people who had spent 30 years learning to work in tandem. May Stokes was a plump, warm woman who immediately wanted to hold Henry, and did so with practiced competence while asking Nora 14 questions in quick succession about the baby's age and feeding habits and sleep schedule. Hiram Stokes shook Marcus's hand and said, in a low aside, that it seemed like the Garrett place was coming up in the world. Marcus ordered supplies: flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, nails, a new length of rope, and while the order was being assembled, Nora moved through the store with her careful, appraising eye, adding 2 items to the list with quiet certainty. A particular kind of soap for Henry's skin, which she explained had been recommended by a doctor, and a small packet of dried chamomile, which she said was useful for a variety of ailments. Marcus paid without comment. On the way home, with the wagon loaded and the afternoon sun beginning its descent toward the western hills, Nora was quiet for a long while and then said, "Thank you for that." "For what?" "For the way you introduced me. The way you said it as a fact, not as an explanation. It made a difference." Marcus kept his eyes on the road. The horses moved with steady, comfortable purpose along the familiar track, and the hill country spread itself around them in the particular amber and ochre beauty of late October, the live oaks still holding their leaves, the cedars dark and solid on the ridgelines. "I find that the truth, stated plainly, requires no defense," Marcus said. She was quiet for another moment. "Then what was Daniel like? As a boy?" Marcus considered the question. "Reckless," he said, "curious about everything. He could talk to any person on earth inside of 3 minutes and make them feel that he had known them for years. He was the kind of person who made rooms brighter by being in them." He paused. "He drove our mother to distraction on a daily basis, and she adored him for it." Nora's expression was soft. "That is exactly how he was in Abilene," she said. "He sat down on those back steps with me, and within 5 minutes I felt as if I had known him forever. He had a way of making you feel seen." She paused. "Not many people have that." "No," Marcus agreed, "not many do." The wagon rattled on, and the horses' hooves beat their steady rhythm on the road. And in the sling against Nora's chest, Henry slept the deep, unconscious sleep of a person who trusts the world completely. And Marcus thought about his brother and about the strange, oblique ways that loss makes itself into something else over time. Not smaller, exactly, but transformed. The way rock is transformed by water into something smoother and still present and oddly beautiful. November came in cold and sharp, bringing the first blue northers down from the plains, and Marcus spent long days on horseback with Emmett and Pete moving cattle to better winter pasture and checking water sources, and doing the 1,000 small maintenance tasks that a ranch required of a man before the hard months settled in. He came home each evening to a warm house and a lit stove and the smell of food cooking, and the contrast between this and the prior year's empty, functional house was so complete that he had stopped noticing it as a contrast and had simply accepted it as the current nature of things. He noticed other things instead. He noticed that Nora hummed to herself when she was working and did not appear to be aware that she did it. Low, quiet tunes that he could not always identify, drifting from the kitchen or the spare room. He noticed that she read by the fire in the evenings after Henry was down, a small collection of books she had apparently carried in her bag despite the impracticality of the weight, and that she read with total absorption, her feet tucked up beneath her, her face quiet and intent. He noticed that she laughed rarely, but when she did it was sudden and genuine and slightly surprised, as if joy caught her off guard on those occasions, which it probably did, he thought, given the shape of the preceding several years of her life. He noticed the bruise on her jaw fade completely over the first 3 weeks, and the small cut on her lip heal to invisibility, and something else fade too. A particular quality of watchfulness she had carried when she first arrived, a braced, ready quality, as if she were accustomed to reacting quickly to unexpected movement. It did not disappear entirely, but it softened, and he was conscious of a deep, specific satisfaction at watching it soften, at knowing that his house was a place where she did not need it. He was careful. He was very careful. He had no right to feel the things that were beginning to develop somewhere behind his breastbone, and he was aware of that. She had arrived here carrying a wound that was still recent, and a baby that was not yet 2 months old, and a history of a man who had used her badly. And Marcus Garrett was not the kind of man who mistook gratitude for affection or confusion for love. He kept his distance, and he was consistent, and he was decent, and he waited, as he had learned to wait, with patience and without expectation. One evening in mid-November, he came in from the barn later than usual, because one of the mares had shown signs of colic, and he had stayed with her until she was comfortable and out of danger. And he was cold to the bone, and tired in the particular way that only physical labor in cold wind can produce. The house was quiet. Nora had already put Henry down for the night, and he hung his coat and hat and was moving toward the kitchen when he found her sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts ledger open and a pencil in her hand and a candle burning low beside her. She looked up when he came in. "The mare, she will be fine. I got her moving and the blockage cleared. She will be sore tomorrow." Nora stood immediately and went to the stove. She poured a cup of coffee and set it on the table, and then, before he could say anything, she went to the pot on the back of the stove and ladled out a bowl of the soup she had made earlier, thick with vegetables and the remains of a roasting chicken. He sat down. She set the bowl in front of him and then sat back down across the table and picked up her pencil again without comment, as if this were simply a normal thing, as if feeding a tired man his supper at 9 o'clock in the evening were just a task like any other. He ate. She worked. The candle burned between them. After a while he said, "You are good with the books." "My father ran a hardware business," she said, without looking up. "I kept his accounts from the time I was 14. He said I had a head for numbers." He said it like a compliment and also like a faint apology, as if a head for numbers was not quite the appropriate attribute for a girl. There was a dry edge to her voice that contained the memory without bitterness. "He was a good man. I miss him." "When did he die?" 4 years ago, before I left Missouri. "He died of pneumonia in the winter, and then my mother went to live with my older sister in St. Louis, and I was 20 years old and I did not want to go to St. Louis. I wanted something of my own. So I answered an advertisement in the paper from a man of good character and reliable income in Abilene, Kansas, seeking a wife." She looked up finally, her expression wry and composed. "You can see how that particular plan developed." "I can see that the advertisement was misleading," Marcus said. "That is a generous way of phrasing it." She tapped the pencil against the ledger. "You have done well with this ranch, Marcus. Given what I have seen in these accounts, the last 3 years have been consistently profitable. Last spring's sale was particularly strong. We got lucky with the price. The market was good. It is not only luck," she said firmly. "It is management. It is the decisions made about when to sell and what to hold and how to allocate the resources. These are good decisions, consistently made. You should not dismiss that." He looked at her across the candlelight, and something warm and specific moved through him that he categorized carefully as appreciation. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a beat longer than she perhaps intended, and then looked back down at the ledger, and a small color appeared in her cheeks that might have been the warmth of the candle and might have been something else. The letter from Clarence Rutherford that arrived in the second week of November was more specific than the first. Nora brought it to Marcus in the barn and handed it to him, and stood with her arms crossed and her face very still while he read it. It was the letter of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the application of social and economic pressure, written in the florid, self-righteous style of someone who believed his own grievances were of cosmic importance. Clarence Rutherford informed Miss Nora Hurst that she had made her situation considerably worse by her flight, that she had stolen certain items from his property upon her departure, which was a lie, Marcus could see from Nora's face, and that he intended to recover what he considered his by whatever means necessary. He also mentioned, with what he apparently intended as calculated menace, that he had friends in the Texas Rangers. Marcus folded the letter and handed it back to Nora. "He does not have friends in the Texas Rangers," Marcus said. "If he did, the letter would not say so." "I know." She tucked the letter into her apron pocket. "But he is the kind of man who follows through on threats when he has made them publicly enough. His pride is considerable and his sense of injury is greater than the actual injury. He will come." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Let him come," he said. "I will ride into town tomorrow and speak with Sheriff Alderman. And I will also speak with a man named Whit Hester who practices law in Caldwell Creek. It will be useful to have a clear account of your legal position documented." She looked at him steadily. "You are spending a considerable amount of time and effort on my behalf. You are working on my ranch and managing my accounts and have significantly improved the quality of my evening meals," Marcus said. "I would say the investment is mutual." She studied him for a moment and then said quietly, "Marcus, I want you to know I am aware of what you are doing, not just the practical things. The way you have made this feel like a place I am allowed to be. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing." He had to work to keep his expression neutral. "You are allowed to be here," he said. "That is simply the truth of it." "Not everyone would see it that way," she said. "A woman alone with a baby that has no father on the premises is not. The world does not always extend generosity in that situation." "The world's generosity is unreliable," Marcus said. "Mine does not have to be." She looked at him for a long time with those clear, serious eyes, and then she nodded once slowly and went back to the house, and Marcus stood in the barn for a moment after she was gone, listening to the horses and the November wind in the roof, and acknowledged privately to himself that he was in very considerable trouble. Sheriff Tom Alderman was a weather-beaten man of 50 with a direct manner and a thorough dislike of what he called Eastern nonsense, by which he meant the particular brand of high-handed self-importance that occasionally rode into Caldwell Creek on the train from cities that considered themselves more civilized. He listened to Marcus's account of the situation with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his expression neutral, and when Marcus was finished he said, "If this Rutherford fellow shows up in my county causing trouble, he will find the welcome considerably less warm than he anticipates." Whit Hester, who was 53, small, neat, and possessed of a legal mind of considerable precision, confirmed what Marcus had suspected, that Clarence Rutherford had no legal authority over Nora Hurst, that an unconsummated engagement in 1878 was not a binding contract, and that the claim of stolen property would require actual evidence to support. He drafted a letter in formal legal language to Rutherford's address in Abilene that made all of this explicitly clear, and he charged Marcus $3 for the work, which Marcus paid without discussion. He did not tell Nora about the $3. He told her about the rest. December came, and with it the particular deep cold of the Texas hill country winter, and the ranch contracted into itself against the weather. The cattle were settled in the protected pastures, the horses were kept closer to the barn, and the household, which Marcus was aware he now thought of as a household rather than simply a house, drew in around the fireplace, and the stove with the comfortable intimacy of a small, warm world. Henry was 3 months old and had become a person of considerable personality, alert and responsive and possessed of a smile that appeared regularly and with devastating effect. Marcus had entirely surrendered to the baby by this point. He would not have admitted it in explicit terms to anyone, but Emmett Cruz had observed him on at least 3 occasions sitting on the kitchen floor with Henry propped against his bent knee, making faces that no one who had ever described Marcus Garrett as a stern and self-contained man would have recognized. Emmett Cruz was a discreet person and had the wisdom to say nothing about this, though the warmth in his eyes when he looked between Marcus and Nora over the supper table told its own story. The evening that things changed between Marcus and Nora arrived without announcement, as the important evenings always do. It was the second week of December, cold enough that the water in the horse trough had a skim of ice on it each morning. They had eaten supper and cleaned up together in the easy, coordinated way they had developed, Marcus washing, Nora drying, a comfortable domestic rhythm that had grown so natural between them that neither of them remarked on it anymore. And Henry was asleep, and the fire was good, and there was no particular reason for either of them to remain in the kitchen, and yet neither of them moved immediately to end the evening. Nora was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee growing cool in her hands, looking out at the winter dark, and Marcus was sitting at the table with his own cup and nothing particular to occupy his hands, and the silence between them was the good kind of silence, the kind that does not require filling. Then she said, without turning from the window, "I used to be afraid of the dark. Not as a child, I was a brave child, but in Abilene with Clarence I became afraid of it. The dark meant he might come home, and I would not see his mood until he was already through the door." Marcus said nothing, because there was nothing appropriate to say to that except silence. She turned from the window. Her expression was thoughtful and a little distant, as if she were reading something written a long way away. "I am not afraid of it here," she said. "I look out that window at the dark and I just see night, trees and stars and night. That is all." She seemed slightly surprised by this, as if the absence of fear were itself a remarkable thing. "I thought you should know that." Marcus set down his cup. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that he generally was not, a specific, steady awareness. "I am glad," he said, and it came out rougher than he intended, with more weight than a simple two-word sentence had any business carrying. She looked at him fully then, and the thing that had been building between them for 2 months, that slow, careful, mutually acknowledged but never addressed thing, was suddenly present in the room with the same clarity and inevitability as the fire in the hearth. "Marcus," she said. "Nora." He stood up. She set her coffee cup down on the counter with a small, decisive click. She walked the 4 steps between them and stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the fine texture of her skin and the exact color of her eyes in the firelight. And she said, very quietly, "I want you to know that whatever I feel is not gratitude. I need you to know that it is not confusion or circumstance, or I need you to know that I know my own mind." "I know you do," Marcus said. "You are the most clear-minded person I have met in a very long time. Then you know that when I say I trust you, not just the circumstance of you, not just the fact that you opened your door, I mean something specific by that. I trust you. You, Marcus Garrett." He lifted his hand slowly and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face with the same careful deliberateness with which he did everything. And she did not flinch, and she did not step back, and the quality of the stillness between them shifted into something entirely new. "And I," he said, "have been sitting across from you at my kitchen table every evening for 2 months telling myself to be patient." A sound escaped her that was almost a laugh. "I have been doing something similar," she admitted. He kissed her then slowly, carefully, with all the patience he had accumulated over 2 months of discipline applied to exactly this single, specific purpose. And she kissed him back with a quiet certainty that confirmed everything he had been slowly, carefully hoping. When they separated, she looked at him with those clear eyes, and there was something in them that he had not seen before, not just warmth, but openness, the particular openness of a person who has decided to stop bracing and to simply be present. "We should be sensible about this," she said, though she did not step away from him. "Absolutely," he agreed. "It has only been 2 months." "It has," he confirmed. "And there are complicated circumstances." "There are," he said. "And none of them change what I am telling you, which is that I would very much like you to stay, not for the cooking or the accounts. I would like you to stay because this house is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and I have not said that to a living person since I can remember." She was quiet for a moment, searching his face with that careful, serious attention she gave to things that mattered. Then she said, "I would like to stay." Clarence Rutherford arrived in Caldwell Creek on a gray Thursday morning in the 3rd week of December, and the first thing Marcus knew about it was when Emmett Cruz rode up to the south pasture where Marcus was working and said, "There is a man at the house. came in a hired buggy, not friendly about it. Marcus rode back to the ranch at a pace that was controlled but deliberate. Rutherford was standing in the yard in front of the porch. He was a broad man of about 40 with the kind of flush-faced, prosperous self-confidence that had probably served him well in commercial settings and made him, Marcus assessed in a single glance, precisely the type of man Daniel had described to Nora on those back steps in Abilene. He was well dressed for the frontier, which suggested he did not spend much time on the frontier. He had a hired man with him who was standing to one side with the practiced neutrality of someone being paid to be present but not necessarily to think. Nora was on the porch. She had come out to meet him rather than retreating, which Marcus had expected of her and which he noted with quiet pride. She was holding Henry in her arms and her expression was entirely composed and entirely cold. Marcus dismounted and handed his reins to Emmett without looking away from Rutherford. "You are on my property," Marcus said. Rutherford turned his flush-faced gaze to Marcus. "And you are Marcus Garrett, I take it. I have come for Nora." "Miss Hurst is employed on this ranch," Marcus said. "She is here by her own choice. She has no legal obligation to you and no intention of leaving. If you have legal business with her, you can speak to Whit Hester in town, who already has documentation of her position. I believe his office sent you a letter to that effect." Rutherford's face went a more emphatic shade of red. "She took my property when she left." "She did not," Marcus said. "And if you intend to make that claim in a legal forum, you will need evidence that does not exist, and a lawyer who is willing to bring the claim, and a judge who is willing to hear it, all of which will require more time and money than this is worth to you. I suggest you go home." "I am not accustomed to being spoken to this way," Rutherford said. "I imagine not," Marcus replied. "Nonetheless." Rutherford looked past him at Nora on the porch. Something moved across his face that Marcus read as the specific frustration of a man who has lost something not because he valued it, but because losing it represents a public failure. "Nora," he said, with the voice of a man who thinks that saying a woman's name in a certain way constitutes authority. "This is foolishness. Come home." "I am home," Nora said. Her voice was clear and utterly steady. The silence that followed was the kind that settles a question. Rutherford looked between Marcus and Nora, and he read the actual situation, not the one he had constructed in his imagination, but the real one, and his expression shifted through anger to something that was the specific deflation of a man who has ridden 11 miles on a hired buggy for nothing. He got back into the buggy. His hired man had the wisdom to follow without being told. Marcus watched the buggy until it was through the gate and on the road back to town. Then he turned and walked to the porch and looked up at Nora. She let out a long, slow breath. Her hands were absolutely steady on Henry. "He will not come back," Marcus said. "No," she agreed. "He will not." That is exactly how a man like that works. He needs to believe the victory is possible before he will try for it. You took the possibility away. She looked at Marcus with an expression that contained something layered and serious and warm all at once. "You are very good at that." "At what?" "At making things simple," she said. "At just doing what needs to be done without drama or negotiation. Just steady." She paused. "You are the steadiest person I have ever known." Marcus looked up at her on the porch, and the winter light was in her dark hair, and the baby was calm in her arms, and the sound of Emmett and Pete returning to work came from the direction of the barn, and the whole of the thing, the whole ordinary, extraordinary reality of his life in that moment pressed itself into him with a clarity that was almost disorienting. "Nora Hurst," he said. "Marcus Garrett," she said back, and there was a smile in it that she let him see entirely. Christmas at the Garrett Ranch in 1878 was a different kind of Christmas than Marcus had experienced in some years. There was a tree, a small cedar that Pete Donahue had dragged in from the east pasture with great ceremony and considerable pride, and Nora had made paper decorations for it, careful geometric shapes that Henry watched from his blanket on the floor with the concentrated attention of a 4-month-old. discovering that the world contains things that move in the light. Emmett Cruz's wife Rosa had come out from town to spend Christmas Day with them, and Rosa was a woman of formidable warmth and cooking ability, who immediately doubled the food output in the kitchen by sheer force of presence. She took one look at the domestic situation at the Garrett ranch and one look at the way Marcus and Nora moved around each other in the kitchen, and she said something to her husband in Spanish that made Emmett nod with the satisfied air of a man whose assessment has been confirmed. After supper, when the lamps were low and Henry was asleep in the cradle that Marcus had built during several late November evenings, a solid, careful piece of woodwork that he had finished with beeswax and presented without commentary, setting it in the spare bedroom while Nora was in the kitchen, and she had come to the doorway and seen it and not said anything for a moment, and then said Marcus, in a voice that was the verbal equivalent of the thing that had happened to her face. After all of that. They sat by the fire, the four of them, and Emmett played a guitar he had brought in from the small cabin, and Rosa sang in a clear, lovely voice, and the Texas winter pressed cold against the windows and could not get in. Nora sat beside Marcus on the settee, close enough that their shoulders were touching, and he felt her lean into him very slightly, just the smallest degree of lean, and he shifted his arm to accommodate it, and she tucked herself against his side with a naturalness that made his heart do something complicated and entirely welcome. Later, after Emmett and Rosa had gone back to the cabin and the fire was dying down, Nora looked up at him and said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me." "I was happy today," she said. "Genuinely, simply happy. I had forgotten it was a thing that was allowed to just happen, without complication. Without the waiting for something to go wrong." She paused. "It is a very remarkable thing to be happy on Christmas Day." "It is," he agreed, looking at her. "I think you should know that a significant portion of it is because of you." "A significant portion," he said, amused. "Henry contributed substantially," she said, and her eyes were bright and warm, and Rosa's pie was not negligible. "But yes. You are Marcus. You are—" She stopped and rearranged her words with the care of someone for whom precision matters. "You are someone I did not know I was looking for," she said finally. "And I am very glad I walked through that rain to your door." He pressed his lips to her temple, and she closed her eyes briefly, and the fire settled lower in the hearth, and the silence of the ranch on Christmas night was the warmest thing Marcus Garrett had ever been inside of. January was cold and clear, and the ranch work expanded again into the full, demanding rhythm of the new year, and Marcus rode his property every morning and came home every evening and ate dinner with Nora, and talked with her about the ranch and the accounts and books and Henry and the town and everything else. And the conversations had the particular quality of conversations between people who are genuinely interested in what the other person thinks, which is a different and rarer quality than conversations between people who are simply companionable. He asked her one evening what she wanted. Not what she needed or what her plans were, but what she actually wanted from this life, from whatever came next. She thought about it seriously in her way. "I want a life that is mine," she said. "I do not mean that selfishly. I mean that I want to be a participant in my own life, not a guest in someone else's story, not a thing to be managed or contained." She looked at him. "I want what we have in this kitchen every evening, this, talking like this, working towards something together." She paused. "I want Henry to grow up in a place where he is loved, where the people around him are good." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" No one had asked Marcus Garrett what he wanted in a very long time. He was aware of the unusual weight of the question. "I have been building this ranch for 8 years," he said slowly. 8 years of work that has been, in itself, satisfying, but that has also been, I have been aware, in the way that you become aware of things that are missing, that I have been building something and keeping it for no particular reason beyond the building of it. I would like a reason beyond the building of it." He looked at her steadily. "I think you know what I am telling you." She held his gaze. Her expression was open and certain. "I think I do," she said quietly. He proposed on a Saturday in late January. He did it properly. He had ridden into town on Friday and spoken to Whit Hester about a marriage license and to Francine Beaumont about the practical requirements of a civil ceremony. And he had also, because it seemed right, written a letter to Nora's sister in St. Louis and another to Nora's mother explaining the situation and asking, as a matter of form and genuine respect, for their blessing, which arrived 2 weeks later in a letter from her mother that contained warmth and relief in approximately equal measure. But the proposal itself was not planned or staged. They were in the kitchen after supper, the same kitchen where everything important seemed to happen, and Nora was putting the dishes away and Henry was on his blanket on the floor, and Marcus said, "Nora." She turned to look at him. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the circumstances or the baby or the gossip or anything practical, because I love you. I have been slowly and certainly and completely falling in love with you since the night you stood on my porch in the rain before you had even raised your hand to knock, and I would like to do this honestly and openly and permanently." He paused. "I understand if you need time." She set down the dish in her hand. She walked to him. She put both hands on his face the way people in books do, and he had always thought that was a theatrical gesture, and he found out, standing in his kitchen in January of 1879, that it was not theatrical in the slightest. "Yes," she said. "Marcus, yes." The wedding was held on the 1st of March, 1879, in the Caldwell Creek Church, which also served as the schoolhouse 3 days a week, and which Reverend Alton had agreed to make available for a Saturday afternoon ceremony. It was not a large affair, but it was a real one. Francine Beaumont organized the women of the town into a collective enthusiasm that resulted in flowers and a wedding cake and a considerable quantity of food, because Francine had decided that Nora Hurst's transition into Nora Garrett was a thing worth celebrating properly, and had communicated this decision to the town with the authority of someone who is not accustomed to being argued with. Rosa Cruz made Nora's dress. It was blue, a deep, warm blue that Nora had admired in the fabric at the general store and had said once was her favorite color, and Rosa had made it in 2 weeks of evening work in the small cabin, and it fit Nora in a way that made Marcus, standing at the front of the church watching her walk toward him, feel as if the world had briefly become too large and too full of extraordinary things to be entirely real. Henry was in Rosa's arms in the front pew, wearing a small white gown that Rosa had also made, and he was behaving with all the dignity and solemnity of a 5-month-old, which is to say that he was examining the ceiling with tremendous interest and occasionally verbalizing his findings. Emmett Cruz stood with Marcus. Young Pete Donahue stood nearby with his hat in his hands, and his freckled face so red with emotion that 2 of the women in the pews sent each other knowing looks. Reverend Alton read the ceremony in his plain, straightforward way, and Marcus and Nora spoke their vows to each other in the clear, quiet voices of people who mean every word and know the weight of it. And when it was done, and Marcus kissed his wife for the first time in front of the assembled population of Caldwell Creek, the resulting noise was considerably louder than the small building probably warranted. That evening, back at the ranch with the celebration concluded, and Emmett and Rosa gone home and Pete presumably asleep in the bunk cabin, Henry finally settled after a long day of social stimulation. Marcus and Nora sat on the porch in the cold March night with blankets around their shoulders and looked out at the hill country dark and the enormous scatter of stars above it. "Mrs. Garrett," Marcus said. She laughed, that sudden, surprised laugh that he had come to love particularly. "That is going to take some adjusting too," she said. "You have time," he said. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the quiet of the ranch that was theirs and looked at the stars. "I keep thinking about that night," she said after a while. "When I came to your door. I was so frightened, Marcus. I had walked I do not know how many miles in the rain, and I was so cold, and Henry was crying, and I had no certainty at all that you would help me, or that you would be the man Daniel said you were. I had only faith in a dead man's recommendation and the desperation of having no other option. She paused. And you opened the door before I knocked. I heard something, he said, or felt something. I cannot explain it. I believe you, she said. I believe that things happen the way they are supposed to sometimes. Not always, not even often, but sometimes. He held her closer in the cold night. I am glad you came, he said. I am glad you walked through the rain. I am glad you were home, she said. Spring came with a rush of green and warmth and the particular explosive energy of the Texas hill country emerging from winter, and the ranch expanded back into its full, demanding rhythm. There were calves to bring in and brand and record, and there were fences to mend after the hard months, and there was planting in the small kitchen garden that Nora had surveyed with a practical eye, and then systematically doubled in size, enlisting Pete's enthusiastic if occasionally misdirected labor. Henry was 6 months old and had become fully mobile in the rolling sense, not yet crawling but capable of covering surprising amounts of ground by a combination of rolling and determined writhing that kept Nora and Marcus both watchful and amused. He was a beautiful child with his mother's clear eyes and a broad, easy smile, and an apparently inexhaustible interest in everything within reach. He had taken to Marcus from the early weeks with the uncomplicated trust of an infant who has no historical reason not to, and Marcus had long since stopped thinking of him as anything other than his son. He said it aloud for the first time one evening in April when Emmett was at the table for supper, and Henry was on Marcus's knee working intently at a carved wooden horse that Marcus had made during a rainy afternoon the previous week. Emmett asked about the child's progress in some innocent domestic context, and Marcus said, without thinking, "He is pulling himself up on the chair legs now. I think he will walk before the summer is out." He had said and then he said in exactly the same tone, "I think he is going to be the kind of boy who does everything faster than you are ready for." And there was no distinction in his voice between the two pronouns, no hesitation, no qualification. He was simply talking about his son. He looked up and found Nora looking at him from across the table. Her expression was the specific, quiet fullness of a person who has received something they were not expecting and are not certain what to do with the size of it. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back down at Henry and continued his sentence about the summer, and Emmett Cruz looked at his plate and smiled into it. Later that evening, Nora came to find Marcus where he was working in the barn, and she said, "What you said at supper." "I know," he said. She put her arms around him from behind, her forehead against his shoulder blade, and held on for a moment. "Henry is lucky," she said, somewhat into his back. "We both are," he said. By summer, Henry was indeed walking, with the magnificent tottering confidence of a new walker who has not yet developed an appropriate respect for gravity. And the ranch was full of the sounds of a child discovering the enormous, endlessly fascinating world of a working cattle operation. Emmett Cruz, who was in most contexts a man of measured speech, described Henry one afternoon as the finest young ranch hand he had encountered, which made Marcus genuinely laugh and made Nora press her lips together in that way she had when she was very pleased about something. The summer also brought something else. Nora came to Marcus on a July evening with a particular expression on her face, careful and a little awed, and trying to be certain before she said it, and told him that she believed she was with child again. Marcus stood in the kitchen and looked at her for a moment and then crossed to her and held her face in his hands the way she had held his face when she accepted his proposal, and he kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again, and she laughed against his shoulder. "Are you happy?" She asked because she was Nora and she needed to ask things directly. "I am extremely happy," Marcus said. "Are you?" "I am terrified," she said, "and extremely happy." The pregnancy went well. Nora remained active well into the autumn. She would not, she informed Marcus, become decorative, and she continued managing the accounts and cooking and gardening with minor modifications. Marcus was attentive without being overbearing, which Nora had made clear she required, and Henry was fascinated by his mother's changing shape in the particular way of very young children who have no preconceptions about what is normal. Their son was born in February of 1880, in the same spare bedroom where Nora had spent her first night on the Garrett ranch, with Rosa Cruz serving as midwife. Rosa had delivered most of the babies in the Caldwell Creek area for the past decade and was entirely competent, and Marcus pacing the main room with the particularly useless energy of a man who is very capable in most situations and entirely helpless in this one. When Rosa opened the door and said, "You have a son, Marcus," the specific quality of relief and joy that moved through him was different from anything he had experienced before, not smaller than other powerful feelings, but a different kind of large, a different dimension of the thing. They named him Daniel James Garrett, Daniel for the dead brother who had sent a woman in the rain to the right door. James for Marcus's father, who had built the original cabin on this land 20 years ago and who deserved the remembrance. Daniel James, who was born on a cold February night in the hill country of Texas with his father's dark hair and his mother's Winter Creek eyes, and who immediately announced his presence to the world with a voice that suggested he intended to be heard. Nora lay in the bed and held the baby and looked at Marcus with an expression that contained everything: the rain and the fear and the walk in the dark and the open door and the accounts ledger and the Christmas fire and the blue dress and the vows and all of it, and said, "Hello, Daniel." "Hello, Daniel," Marcus said, standing beside her looking at his son. Henry, who was 14 months old and full of opinions, was brought in by Rosa to meet his brother and regarded the new arrival with the complex expression of a child encountering something that is both exciting and suspicious. He pointed at the baby. He looked at his father. He said something that was not quite a word yet but contained a clear request for clarification. "That is your brother," Marcus told him. Henry appeared to weigh this information. Then he patted the baby's wrapped foot with one small hand, very gently, with the deliberate care of a child being careful, and Marcus felt Nora's hand find his and hold it. The years that followed were good years, the kind that do not make for dramatic telling, but that constitute the actual substance of a life well constructed. The ranch grew, steadily and intelligently under the management of two people who were good at different things, and trusted each other enough to defer to those competencies. Marcus added another 300 acres to the east in 1881, and by 1882 they were running close to 1,000 head of cattle. Emmett Cruz's position was formalized as ranch foreman, with a raise that was long overdue, and Pete Donahue eventually did follow a girl to San Marcos. Her name was Clara, and she was a school teacher, and she had Pete entirely unraveled within 2 weeks of their first meeting, which everyone who knew Pete had predicted would be precisely how it would happen, and was replaced by 2 new hands, both good men. Nora's accounts kept the ranch profitable through a cattle market that turned difficult in 1882 and required careful navigation. Her decision to sell at a specific moment in the spring of that year, which she argued for based on her reading of the market reports that came in on the mail coach, saved them from the loss that hit several of the neighboring operations. Marcus took her assessment over his own instinct and was glad he did. In the spring of 1883, their daughter was born. She came in April, which in the Texas Hill Country is the most beautiful month, when the bluebonnets cover every hillside and the air smells of cedar and wildflower, and the light is the particular gold of a season that has not yet become harsh. They named her Clara Ann Clara for Pete Donahue's schoolteacher wife, who had become a genuine friend to Nora over the preceding year, and Ann for Nora's mother, who had lived to write a letter when she heard of the birth of her first grandchild and who expressed, in the formal letter-writing style of a woman of her generation, a happiness that was evident beneath every careful word. Clara was, from the first, entirely different from both her brothers. Where Daniel had announced himself, Clara observed. Where Henry had charged at everything, Clara assessed. She had Marcus's dark eyes and Nora's fine-boned face, and a disposition that combined his quiet steadiness with her mother's absolute clarity of mind. Marcus, who had not spent much time imagining what it would be like to have a daughter, found out in the first hour of Clara's life that it was the specific thing that had been missing from his life in a way he had not been equipped to identify before she existed. Henry adored her immediately and without reservation. Daniel, who was 3, was intrigued by the addition and expressed his feelings primarily through standing very close to Clara's cradle and providing running commentary on her activities, which in the early weeks consisted primarily of sleeping and eating, but which Daniel described with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything. One evening in the summer of 1883, when Clara was 3 months old and Daniel was 3 and Henry was 4, and the ranch was quiet in the long summer evening light, Marcus found Nora sitting on the porch steps with the baby in her lap, watching the older 2 boys chase each other around the old pecan tree by the gate with the inexhaustible energy of small children who have not yet learned that exhaustion is a possibility. He sat down beside her on the steps. The hill country spread itself before them in the evening gold, the pastures and the fences and the post oaks and the cattle in the distance, and the wide Texas sky coming into its evening colors, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses called out to another, and the sound of Emmett Cruz talking to the new hand carried from the direction of the corrals. "Marcus," Nora said, "do you remember the night I arrived?" "I do." "Do you remember what you said when you opened the door?" Before I had even said a word about who I was or why I was there. He thought for a moment. He did remember. He had not thought about it in those specific terms in some time, but he remembered it clearly, the door opening and the rain and the woman and the baby, and the particular decision that had been made without conscious thought. "I said come inside," he said. She turned to look at him with those clear eyes that he knew as well now as he knew his own hands, as well as he knew the land and the light and the particular sound of this place that had been his for 8 years and hers for almost 5 and theirs completely. "You said come inside," she confirmed, "before I had told you my name or why I was there or anything about the baby or any of it. You opened the door and you said come inside." She was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about that many times, what you risked in that moment letting a stranger in from the rain without any information. Most people would have asked questions first." "The rain was very bad," Marcus said. "The rain was very bad," she agreed and smiled at him with the full warmth of it. "But also, you were exactly who Daniel said you were, the most decent man he knew." She shifted Clara carefully and leaned into Marcus's shoulder. He was right. He was entirely right. Marcus put his arm around his wife, and they sat on the porch steps of the house that was theirs, watching their sons run in the evening light with the blue-gold sky of Texas overhead, and their daughter breathing soft and steady between them. And the sound of the ranch going about its evening business came to them on the warm air. And the whole of the life they had built together pressed itself into that moment, with the gentle, insistent weight of something true and permanent and enormously good. Henry fell down near the pecan tree and bounced back up immediately with the rubber resilience of a 4-year-old and kept running. Daniel, who had the specific focus of a 3-year-old on a mission, caught a grasshopper in the grass by the fence and held it up for inspection with tremendous pride. The horses shifted in the corral. The cattle grazed in the far pasture against the long evening light. "I am glad," Marcus said, "not to any specific thing, or to all of it, or to the sum of it, which was the same." Nora turned her face up to him, and the light was in her dark hair, and the baby was warm between them, and the world was very large and very beautiful and entirely theirs. "So am I," she said. "So am I, Marcus Garrett." He kissed her in the last of the evening gold, and the boys kept running in the grass below, and Clara and Garrett made a small sound of contentment in her sleep, and the star-enormous Texas sky began to fill itself with light above the hill country, and the Garrett ranch settled into the good, deep quiet of a home that is full of the right things. Many years later, when Henry was grown and had his own land to the north, and Daniel was reading law in Austin, and Clara was the kind of clear-eyed, composed young woman who made her mother smile with recognition. There was a photograph taken at the ranch, the kind of formal portrait that was becoming possible by then, a traveling photographer passing through Caldwell Creek. And in it, Marcus and Nora sat in the straight-backed manner that photographs required. And their children stood around them in the particular arrangement of people who are comfortable with each other. And there was something in the image that people who saw it later sometimes remarked upon. It was something in the way Marcus and Nora sat. Not the formal proximity of the portrait, but something underneath it, a quality of absolute familiarity and ease, the specific closeness of two people who have known each other's silences as thoroughly as each other's words, who have built something real together out of a rainy night and an open door, and a dead man's good recommendation, and the particular grace of being given and taking a second chance at the kind of life that most people only manage to approximate. In the photograph, Nora's hand was in Marcus's, and his thumb was curved over her knuckles in the unconscious gesture of a man who has held the same hand for many years and does not need to think about it anymore, because it is simply the natural position of his hands when she is beside him. It was, people said, a good photograph. It was, more accurately, a good life. The proof of it was in everything, in the ranch that had grown and prospered, and was known throughout the hill country as one of the well-run operations, managed by a man who was steady and a woman who was sharp, and both of whom were honest. In the children who were loved and secure and knew it without having to be told. In Emmett Cruz, who had stayed all those years and whose own children had grown up alongside the Garrett children in the comfortable way of ranch life. In the kitchen table where they had talked every evening about everything that mattered. In the porch steps where they had sat together and watched the light change over the Texas hills through every season. In the spare bedroom that had been a refuge, and then a nursery, and then a room for guests. And then, when Henry's boy came to visit, the bedroom of a grandchild who slept in the same bed where his grandmother had first slept on a rainy October night in 1878. And in all of it, underneath all of it, like the bedrock underneath the hill country that is invisible until you look for it and then is obviously, absolutely everywhere, the simple fact of a man who opened his door before she knocked, because something in him already knew that what was standing on the other side of it was something worth opening the door for. That was where it had started. That was where everything had started. And it never, in all the years that followed, had reason to end.